Hello, I'm Chris Slisher, and welcome to Turning of the Wheel, an intelligent, lively discussion about astrology, art, and spiritual adventure. Timing is everything, and as the great wheel turns, we are best prepared when we are best informed. Join me as I explore concepts that allow us to broaden our view of the world. You'll hear interesting topics, meet fascinating guests, and discover who you really are. Using the time-tested practices of astrology, you'll learn how to accept change as the great wheel of life turns. Astrology, art, and spiritual adventure on Turning of the Wheel TV with Chris Slisher. Hello, and welcome to Turning of the Wheel. My name's Chris Slisher. This is a show about astrology, art, and spiritual adventure. And today, we're going to be talking about the signs. I'm going to start talking about the signs. So in coming segments each month, I'll be on the sign that's in the season that we're in at that time. So we're on the brink of stepping into the world of Pisces. So I'm going to start with Pisces. Even though the zodiac wheel starts with Aries, I'm going to start with Pisces. So I'm starting at the end, and we're going to work our way in from there and work our way around. But I want to be in sync with where people are at the time. So it's important that we do it that way. So starting February 19th to March 20th, whenever that may be, whatever year that may be, that is the sign of Pisces. Pisces is a water sign. It's the sign where you see the two fishes going either way like that. It is a mutable water sign. Now, I've talked about mutability in the past. Mutable means they're more adaptable. There's four mutable signs, one for each of the four elements, and Pisces is the mutable water component of that. It's a very mutable means it's adaptable. They are the people who will bend. You know, if you have a mutable sign with a fixed sign, the fixed sign's going to win because the mutable sign tends to adapt. They're more compliant, they're more flexible as a rule, and as a result, they are more in that kind of category. So they're more mutable. So a mutable water sign. Typically, water signs are deeply intuitive, they're emotional, they have a great sense of depth. You know, the whole concept of still waters run deep is very much in keeping with the Pisces. Now, some of the characteristics of Pisces, all signs, by the way, have two sides to them. They have positives and negatives, weaknesses and strengths, attributes and assets, liabilities and assets, however you want to look at it, it's the same idea. And it's one of those interesting signs that is at a time of year, depending upon where you are on the globe, but these general things are the same. Pisces, being a water sign, would also be compliant with somebody else who's a water sign. So we've got Scorpios that are water signs, and we've got Cancers that are water signs. Because they are a water sign, they would also get along with, guess what? An earth sign, because earth and water mix. They may make mud, but they mix. That's an old standard astrology joke, excuse me. But anyway, and that doesn't mean that they make mud. I'm just saying fire and air get along, earth and water get along. So you might see a good combination of a Pisces with a Taurus or a Virgo or a Capricorn. It's the same idea. So the water and the earth get together because they have a natural symbiotic relationship brought about by the elemental characteristics of the sign. Okay? So what is a Pisces? Good question. Pisces are one of the hardest signs to really pin down. And there's many branches of astrology that consider them to be, since they're at the very end of the zodiac wheel, you know, not that there really is a beginning or an ending. If you're a Pisces, that's where the world begins. But as we look at the zodiac, starting with Aries and the houses and the way they lay out, Pisces is typically the 12th house. Many people, many astrologers, over the course of my studies and reading, assume that Pisces is sort of the accumulation of all the signs around the chart. So there's this coalition of, you know, attributes. But I think it's more than that. It's a much deeper sign than that. You know, they are a very unusual sign because they tend to be very lofty, dreamy, spacey, very intuitive, very artistic. Oftentimes you'll find great spiritual leaders are Pisceans because they have that deep sense of understanding. Empathy is one of the strongest characteristics of a Pisces. Empathy, sympathy, sensitivity, a strong aesthetic sense, all of those things are very sort of amorphous, kind of intangible things you can't really touch. And by the opposite side of that, those are some of the characteristics that are not so great about a Pisces. They tend to be forgetful, they tend to be space shots, they sort of walk around in their own little dream world. They are, you know, careless and carefree sometimes to an extent. So we have a combination of this. All signs, by the way, are mixed of a duality of characteristics. Some are good, some are bad. We've all got that. I mean, what person is not flawed? Present company excluded. Anyway, so they're not always known for their logic. They are somewhat reclusive, so they tend to be withdrawn. They're not the people that are typically out on the stage. And that's not to say that you won't find a singer who's out on stage, who's singing along and doing everything else. You know, you'll find people who are very much like that. But more so than not, they are the deep thinkers. They're the ones who have this deep spiritual wellspring that sort of comes from inside. And it's very difficult. Now don't forget, I'm making very broad general comments about Pisces. If you're a Pisces, you know what I'm talking about. If you know a Pisces, you'll also know what I'm talking about. These are people who tend to be somewhat forgetful sometimes. They're lost in their worlds. They can be very imaginative, very artistic, deeply intuitive, spiritual, sensitive, dreamlike. As I said, they're also careless. They're sometimes vague. They're receptive, though. And they also are not always logical. I'm looking at my list here because there's so many words that go with them. And they are a wonderful sign with a great sense of aestheticism. So aestheticism is sort of that intangible quality. It's like taste, okay? You can't really teach someone to have taste. They either have it or they don't. The Pisces typically have good taste. There's this strong aesthetic eye that they have. They recognize beauty, they recognize certain characteristics, and when they have those characteristics, they can use them. It's a skill set, it's a talent. They're able to sort of bring that into them. And each of us has a chart, a piece of our chart that is occupied by that piece of chart called the Pisces. There's some of you have planets in Pisces, and those planets are going to take on the characteristics of that, okay? Very much the case. Some of you may have no planets in Pisces. I'm not saying that you do, but if those of you who do, you would know that. If you've got Venus in Pisces, for example, that it's exalted there, you're going to feel a strong sense of aestheticism. Now, when we look at Pisces, as I said, you know, the places where we find it best is in areas that deal with sort of the illusion and the delusion. So we'll often find Pisces, and this is directly tied to the fact that Neptune is the ruler. Neptune, if you've looked at my other episodes in the past, you will see, and you can get them from turningofthewheel.com. You can find my other episodes there. There's my website on the screen over there. There it is. And you can find the combination. If you look up Neptune, you'll see me talking about all of these characteristics. Neptune rules illusion. It's like where you see photography, where you see film, where you see psychiatry, where you see psychotherapy, that realm of the unconscious sort of spot where things are hard to be tangible. They're very dreamlike, hard to get a fix on. And as a result of that, they are, this is the realm of fantasy. So things like Harry Potter and the Lord of the Rings are all very Piscean by nature because they are living in a fantasy world. You know, Walt Disney had a strong sense of Pisces in his chart when you deal with Alice in Wonderland and people like that. And when I list off some of the people who were the strong Pisces, you'll know what I'm talking about. They're very deep thinkers. Deep thinkers, they have a vision, they have a deep sense of intuition, and that intuition is what drives them. And it's an intangible. Intuition is an intangible characteristic. You can't say, you can't go out and learn intuition by this. You can train yourself to be more intuitive. But if you have a natural affinity towards intuition, you're going to be able to exemplify that and exercise that when it comes to making decisions or choosing which way you want to go. The reason I mentioned Neptune is because it's the ruler, obviously, but it's also representative of what a Pisces is. Neptune is, I said, is this great illusion delusion. So when we think about, and we find many spiritual leaders in Pisces, we'll find people who are ministers and people who are counselors often have a strong Piscean sense because they're able to tap into things. When you meet with a minister or a spiritual person, they operate on a different realm. They're in a different world. They're touched with a different perspective. They sort of operate at a higher octave, I guess you could say. That's not to say that they're better or anything else or more lofty than any of us, but they have a certain sense of placement for the esoteric realm of what it means to be a human. That sort of intuitive gut feelings. These are the intuitive gut feelings. It's very, very sensitive. So an artist, which we find many artists are Pisces, or have a strong Pisces component, a Pisces moon or a Pisces ascendant, they would have this strong sense of the aesthetic sense of art. Art would play a very strong sense, and art could be any number of things, from the tactile quality of what a surface would feel like, or the fabric of a clothing, or the colors that you see, and the way the placement, interior design are areas where we would see in Pisces, very logical place. But also with, as I said, therapists do very well there because they're dealing in the subconscious. This is the area where Pisces really rules. Deep, deep thinkers, spiritual people, and a sense of real placement in the world. But on the other side of that coin, there is this real sort of dreamlike quality, almost spacey. I mean, for lack of a better word. I mean, I know that's a hard word to really put your finger on and a hard word to really describe, because how do you describe spacey? But if you know a Pisces and you have someone who's always forgetting things and losing things and forgetting to lock the car and sort of forgetting things here and there or not quite keeping up with it, you'll see that that's to be the case. Now, this is especially the case if you had Pisces rising. You would be more so that way than if you were perhaps a Pisces sun. It's the characteristic of where it is in your chart that is going to color and imbue the nature of Pisces in that individual. After all, we are a composite of all the signs because each of us has a chart that has all the signs in it. In some place in your chart, there is a relationship to the Pisces part of the pie, whether that is in, whether it's part of your, whether it's in one of your houses, which it obviously would be, or if you have a sign, or if you have a planet in that area of your chart, you would definitely have the influence there. Now, the people who I think of who are strong Pisces are those people who really do operate in a different realm. And this is not meant to be a criticism, it's simply a basic observation of what it is to be a Pisces. You can't really discount that. I mean, when we see that time come around, and it's kind of symbolic in some ways of the emergence of, when the season's coming, leading up the end of the year in many ways, I believe, is sort of coming up to the spring equinox, when we have that new burst of energy. Now, the spring equinox obviously is different on the southern hemisphere, but we're in the northern hemisphere, so we'll talk about that. It's sort of the end of the great thaw, okay? So there's been this deep period of time when people have been sort of hibernating, and then there comes this thaw, and we enter into this season right before we get to the spring equinox, when we sort of have that new birth of time and energy. So astrology was always based on the seasons, always based on the seasons and the cycles of the moon. All of that were there, and that's how all the ancients would dictate their ideas and do what they knew was right at the time, because timing is everything, as I've always said. So when we look at Pisces again, we see that very watery. And water, if you think of water, water is a great neutralizer. It's a one that brings things together. It sort of is an equalizer because it levels the playing field for all people. So this sensitivity, this deep water, water represents emotion. And the Pisces are very emotional people, can be very emotional. But they can also be very sort of chilly in some respects because they're almost too sensitive. What I mean by that is a Pisces is someone who understands something on a very deep intuitive level, but may not let that be known to the world. So in that regard, they're sort of holding it in. The sensitivity may be so great that they're afraid to open up that shell and let that be seen. And that is a critical piece, because letting that be seen would be opening yourself to vulnerability. You'd be vulnerable. You wouldn't have your guard up. And there's no way for a Pisces really to respond to that because they haven't got the wherewithal. They're not a forceful, charging Aries kind of person who's going to go blazing into the jungle. They're not that big, bold Leo who walks into the room and takes over. That's not their personality type. They're much more aesthetically driven. They're much more in line with the sort of the lofty, dreamy characteristics. I'm going to give you some ideas of people who were, and this is going to make perfect sense when you hear about it. When you talk about artists, artists are the ones that I talk about who have this great sense of being able to see things that other people can't see, especially at their time. And some of the greatest names that I think of are Michelangelo and the painter Renoir, were both Pisces. Now, at their time, even though we look back at them and we see, wow, these people were, you know, what they were thinking of at the time has come to fruition, yes. But to discover them when they discovered them and to implement them when they implemented them put them way ahead of their time. When we look at Michelangelo, we see this mathematical precision playing out in his designs and the effluvia man that he had, the character that he shows. All of those things are, Vitruvian man, I'm sorry. All of those characteristics are there and very real, and we see that in the artist, and we see what he did with his work. Michelangelo was a fabulous inventor and person who was able to think, because he had the time and the mental energy to think. At the time that he was born, there was no, Neptune had not been discovered yet. So Jupiter was the planet that ruled in the old ancient Hermetic astrology days. We had the different rulers back then. And so Michelangelo and Renoir. Renoir, fabulous painter when you think about painters. When you think of other artists, we think of Ansel Adams was a Pisces. Ansel Adams was the great photographer. Remember I talked about photography when I talked about Neptune. Neptune and photography go together, as does film. Film, because it presents an illusion. You can color that photograph in a way that casts a certain image. What is it about a photograph that has personality, that has a sense of place, what gives you the ability to immediately understand what's going on? You catch an impression on a child's face, or you see this gigantic lofty mountain like he did when he took his pictures in Yellowstone of El Capitan. How do you get that across unless you have that eye? That eye was what he had. Ansel Adams, the great photographer, was a Pisces. Interesting people. Steve Jobs was a Pisces. Steve Jobs, the man behind Apple, was a Pisces. Now, if ever there was a man who had a vision, if ever there was a man who knew how to go from one realm of the world, which was very much of a computer kind of interface, computer screen, to the phone in our hands, the phone that we now carry in our hands, any man who could do that, make that leap, and then package it the way he did and has that strong aesthetic sense, that sense of how do we make this work, that sense of beauty. It's a beautifully packaged, beautifully branded. It's an example. Many companies try to emulate what Apple has done with regard to branding. It's unheard of what has happened. The fact that he's able to take a computer and then open up retail stores based on a wide array of things is phenomenal. This was a true visionary. Very much of a Neptunian kind of man who looked at life through a different set of lenses. This is the realm of Pisces. Pisces is the great dreamer. Other people, interesting people come to mind as far as religious leaders. L. Ron Hubbard is a Pisces. L. Ron Hubbard, as you know, perhaps, is the man behind Scientology. Scientology is Tom Cruise and any number of other people who are involved with Scientology. I think it's any number of people are. John Travolta is also involved in Scientology. Scientology is a very, very unusual faith, and it is that realm of spirituality that sort of paints this, magical area, a fantasy-like area where people enter into and give up themselves and become and morph into. This is very much an area where he had the ability, the charisma, to draw these people in through that. Very unusual kind of person if you think about it. And another person who's fascinating is Dr. Seuss. Dr. Seuss. Who doesn't know Dr. Seuss? The Grinch Who Stole Christmas and everything else, Green Eggs and Ham, all those fantastical books which I grew up on and are written through the eye of a man who has this deep sense of a new world. He created a whole new world with all new language. He totally stepped into this realm and created a whole new world and a whole new language that was built around these elusive, vague kind of ideas. This is a classical Piscean person. And when you see these personalities and you know what they've done, you can begin to construct a profile of who the Pisces is. And if you know any Pisces in your world, you should have them watch this, obviously, and contact me to get a thorough reading. But nonetheless, at turningofthewheel.com is my website, or chrisflisher.com will get you both to the same place. When you know a person who has this, and you may very well have this in your chart, if you are an artist, if you have a strong sense of ability, if you have this sense of art and structure and line and form and that amorphous ability to create magical spaces and enter into a world of fantasy, you may very well have, even if you're a fan of these kinds of movies, you may have a very strong recognition with what it means to be a Pisces. There's that sense of intuition, that sense of what it is that's valuable and how it works and why these are valuable. Another person who is very well known in the world of Pisces was John Steinbeck, the famous author who wrote Grapes of Wrath, East of Eden, Travels with Charlie, Of Mice and Men, Cannery Row, all books that he wrote. Fabulous, fantastic American author who captured a part of our history, very unique and very much built out of his own observations of this. But you see, in order to understand, in order for Steinbeck to create the work that he created, he had to understand his characters. He understood his characters because he had empathy, he had sympathy, and he was able to translate that into his characters. Not an easy task. Ask anybody who's a writer how difficult it is to paint those difficult character sketches, and they will tell you it is very hard to do. These are the ideas that come up through the concepts of what we see when we look at these people who have this great sense. It's that ability to be spiritual. It's that ability to be intuitive. It's that ability to be secluded in some ways, restrained, quiet, and yet very dreamlike and fantasy-oriented. Fantasy, dreams, illusion, film, painting, invention in some ways, like Steve Jobs. All those areas are very much imbued with this great Piscean sense. There's two other people I'm going to talk about as we get further on that are going to surprise you, although by the time I get done talking to you about them, you'll understand why they fit the mold. But I want to get back to the Renoirs and the Michelangelos because I think they, in some ways, especially Renoir, is kind of the classic Piscean person. I think of him as the classic Piscean person, but I also think of Steve Jobs in the same way. They're both people who sort of broke through boundaries, who had to have this sense. One of the strongest characteristics of the Apple name brand and the Apple branding is the aesthetic quality. There's not a single product that you don't get that isn't packaged beautifully, that isn't presented beautifully. A simplicity, a beautiful organization of line and use. Those are all part of his great vision that came out of what he was looking to accomplish. Took a real visionary to get that place. And that is what a Pisces is. A Pisces is a visionary. What happens when you take a Pisces and you put them into a difficult situation? I understand Steve Jobs had a very, sort of unusual upbringing. That is what imbues and colors that. So every sign will have that. All the things I'm stating right now are very generalized ideas of what a sign is. Yes, always a generalization. If you want specifics, you've got to contact me. Chris at chrisflisher.com or turningofthewheel.com is my website. I'm on YouTube, I'm on Facebook, I'm on Twitter. Contact me and I will help elaborate how this works. It really does come through a conversation because the particulars of the individual's chart really are unique to the individual. And you've got Pisces, and a piece of your chart is in Pisces. So there's something about your life that is ruled by this sense of this amorphous sense, whether it's art, whether it's music, whether it's poetry, whether it's clothing. All of these areas are the areas of the Pisces. You may be a home designer, a home interior designer. Now, the two people I've left for the very end are important because they are also Pisces, and you may not think of them as the type of person who would be Pisces. The first one I'm going to mention is George Washington. George Washington was a Pisces. And we think of that, we think of George Washington. We think of George Washington as perhaps the great bold leader going out and charging on and taking on the British and starting out. But he also got the pulse of the nation. He understood where the nation had to go. He had that great sense of spirituality. He had that sense of a duty, that sense of purpose. That was a very spiritually oriented, that helped him construct that idea of who he was and what the country would be. So it's interesting. The United States is a nation that's a Cancer nation, okay? Our birthday is July 4th, 1776 at 5:08 p.m. in Philadelphia, PA, Pennsylvania, when the Declaration of Independence was signed. That makes us a Cancer nation. Every nation, every entity, every person has a point in time where they begin. That's the beginning of the United States. So to have the United States be a Cancer nation with a Pisces leader, we have water to water. Perfect. It's a great spot. And that's where we changed our course and we became who we are. We said in that Declaration of Independence who we were. We opened our doors to the world in a very inclusive kind of manner. The last person I'm going to speak to about who is a Pisces is none other than Albert Einstein. Albert Einstein, the man that's most widely recognized as a genius in the world of astrophysics, physics, science, astronomy, quantum physics. His theories are still breaking ground today. He's so far ahead of his time. This man was living in a world unlike any other. We've heard stories, at least I have, heard stories about Albert Einstein, how spaced out he was. He would walk around with his hair all messed up, and he'd often not wear socks, and he'd be wandering around chewing on his pipe, thinking about things, and he was just lost. He was lost. He was lost in his own head, lost in this world of imagination and trying to figure. His thoughts were so deep and so imbued with his sense of science and trying to figure out how this logic worked. His theories were phenomenal. When you look at someone like him, you could also say, yeah, he is a composite of everything that came before him. He was a remarkably bold, brilliant, genius man. And not only was he a scientifically rich man, he was a very deep, warm, spiritual person. Some quotes of his are just breathtaking when you think of the simplicity and the logic of them. There's one that I remember. It says, you cannot simultaneously prepare and prevent war. How phenomenal is that? You cannot simultaneously prepare for and prevent war. That's a quote from Albert Einstein. How logical is that? If you're preparing for war, you certainly can't prevent it. The way to prevent war is not to prepare for it. It's phenomenal. Albert Einstein, known throughout the world as a genius, was a Pisces of the highest order. He's probably the most famous Pisces because he espouses all of those characteristics that we think of as Pisces. Future thinking, reclusive, somewhat spacey. No pun intended. He was out in space, but he was spacey, and he was a space yacht in many ways. As I said, he's wandering around and disheveled because his head was so full of thoughts. He's very sensitive to the world, secretive, careless in some ways, dreamlike, but very receptive to what the world was all about. This is the Pisces. They're wonderful people. And I like all signs, and I will continue on through the whole row of zodiacs. So if you didn't get your sign today, keep tuning into this show and you'll get it. Every 2 weeks, every month I'll be doing a new sign, and we'll get through them all. These are generalizations, yes. If you want details about your chart, contact me, turningthewheel.com, chrisflisher.com, and I'll talk to you all soon.